Hey, good evening, everybody. We are live from the East Coast, so it's good evening for us, but maybe it's good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to the city and the states, the New York City mayoral race. A panel to discuss the upcoming New York City's election. So I'm Nara Roberta Silva. I am core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. And tonight I'm joined by these three wonderful panelists that I'm gonna give a moment to introduce them to y'all. So I have here with me Sia Weaver. So Sia is the—
Recording in progress.
Okay, sorry. So Sia is the campaign coordinator of Housing Justice for All, a coalition of over 80 housing organizations that represent tenants and homeless New Yorkers in their fight to end evictions and homelessness and invest in public housing in the New York State. So she's also a member of the NYC DSA, where she works to coordinate the DSA's housing campaign. So thank you, Sia, for joining us. I also have Susan Kang. So Susan Kang is an associate professor of political science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, one of the Cuny schools. So her research and teaching interests focus on the intersection of international political economy, international human rights, economic and social rights, labor unions, and social movements. She has written books and articles on labor rights, human rights, social movements, and international law. Professor Kang also became active in the state and local politics in New York City since 2017, serving in leadership positions in the New York City chapter of Democratic Socialists of America and co-founding a state politics focused organization, the NOIDC New York. IDC stands for Independent Democratic Conference, which I'm going to actually mention in a bit. She contributes regularly on New York City-based media outlets discussing laughter politics, democratic primaries, and state politics. So Anthony Alessandrini is my colleague, associate faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. He's also a professor of English at Kingsborough Community College, one of the Cuny schools as well. He's also on the faculty of the MA program in the Middle Eastern Studies at the Cuny Graduate Center, where he's also a member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. So we are gonna hear from Susan, Tony, and Sia. We are also going to hear from the audience. So if you want to share your questions in the comments of this Facebook live broadcasting, please feel free to do so. My colleague, Brooklyn Institute Program Director, Mark DeLuca, is actually monitoring the chat. So a shout out to Mark. Thank you so much for helping out with that. I also want to take the moment to thank Cora Walters, Brooklyn Institute Operations Director, and also Dan Yoel for helping out, supporting this event with the overall tech support that allows us to be together here tonight. So as I mentioned in the beginning, so this is a conversation, this is a panel to discuss the upcoming primary elections here in New York. So on June 22nd, voters are going to cast their ballots on their nominees for the general election in November. So, and many of the events of the past year have been referred to characterize the stakes of this election. So for a good couple of weeks, New York was the global epicenter of the pandemic. The city went through a dramatic lockdown that brought to light its problems in a very painful way. The incredible precariousness of great part of its workforce, from the service industry, the tourism industry, the cultural industry, the disparity in health and healthcare access as COVID numbers soared in communities of color, the wave of tenants facing evictions in this unaffordable housing market. And then after a couple of months, the city moved from lockdown to curfew once protests against racist police violence erupted throughout the country. And for weeks, we had an occupation at City Hall to pressure for disinvestment from the police department. And as the city reopens, the lingering effects of the pandemic are still here, right? So we are still struggling around moratoriums and rate cancellations. We are business that have shut down for good, jobs that have disappeared, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So many commentators of this election in the mainstream media stress this post-pandemic scenario, this pandemic/post-pandemic scenario that I just presented here, to say that the upcoming mayor is then tasked with bringing the city back. And I think we can all agree that that's not the point. Here, we are not actually, we don't want the city back to what it was. We actually want to question the setup that was actually offered to us throughout the years. So folks watching us, don't worry, this is not a New York One roundtable. But I actually wanted to start with the pandemic and the post-pandemic scenario to stress actually how many grievances have come to the surface in this past months. In social movements studies, which is a theme of many of my classes here at the Brooklyn Institute, some call this a political opportunity, right? A moment of potential leverage that folks can actually activate to promote change. And along this line, it's also important to consider that this election cycle in particular coincided with term limits of a vast majority of city level officials. And of course, the mayor also reached his term limits. So in this scenario of exposed grievances, you also have room for reconfiguration granted by the institutional calendar, let's say, like, let's put this way. And also, this moment of potential reconfiguration can also be read in light of the recent reshaping of the state legislature. So in 2018, like Democrats took control of the state Senate by ousting the group of so-called independent Democrats that would side with Republicans, very much as a result of grassroots efforts, such as the one promoted by Susan. And last year, an entire slate of progressives, like 6 candidates, got their ticket to Albany. So, and I'm not even mentioning here the representatives that went to Washington, D.C., right, which is also known. But what actually seems then a solid, or seemed, I don't know, a solid ascension of the left in the state and in the city is then at odds with what is actually taking shape in this mayoral race, like who actually is scoring high at the polls, right? So what we have at the moment is candidates seen as moderates by the mainstream media, taking the lead, and self-proclaimed progressives trailing behind. So how did we get here? Basically. Yeah, so I actually want to actually set the tone, like bring this question to us, for us, like for the four of us to keep in mind as we unpack this complicated election. And I also invite you folks who are watching us to have actually this question in mind. So how did we get here? And of course, questions like this also push us to think, okay, so then what do we do from here? How we got here? So then how do we move forward? How do we, what is to be done then in this scenario? So I want to actually start by passing it on to Sia, who I think can actually start giving us better sense of this scenario here. Shall we, Sia?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'm actually going to turn on my light. Hope folks can see me okay. So how did we get here? It's a really good question. And I think it's been really challenging, right? The mayoral election is in a lot of ways kind of I want to say like a something more eloquent than a hot mess, but it is really just a hot mess. And I really, to put like a more hopeful light on it, right? I think it's just true that what the left is really experiencing in this mayoral race is growing pains, and what our movements are experiencing is really growing pains. We have been really focused in an oppositional position for such a long time. And I know some of my colleagues on this panel tonight are really going to talk about New York's history of having really conservative mayors and really conservative executives. It really just wasn't so long ago, right, that there were Republicans in control of the state legislature. And so at the same time as we're feeling really badly about the mayoral election, I also do want to name that the growth of social movements is also setting the tone of the entire race, right? We're talking about the role of police in New York, and we are talking about what the role of big public institutions are in New York in this race in a way that is really powerful. Whereas in earlier elections, it would be a foregone conclusion. Law and order is would be a foregone conclusion, right? So even if we are not like loving what's on offer, and even if it's not like necessarily, we don't feel really good about like what might happen in 3 weeks, I would just say that the way that the left has set the conversation has been really an example of growth. So a couple lessons though, I think that I have been trying to take as we grow. The first is that we've really been focused on the state over the last 4 years, I guess probably since 2016 or 17 or 18 maybe. Social movements in New York have been laser focused on Andrew Cuomo, who is a Republican, and even if he doesn't say that, and trying to move the state legislature and transform the state legislature, bring sort of openness and democracy and progressive values into Albany. And we've been tremendously successful at that, right? We have the amount of new people, of young progressives who are in the New York State Legislature, and the amount of socialists who are in the state legislature, and the way that they've been able to sort of get the leadership in the state legislature to, instead of just rolling over to our governor, to actually stand up to him, to pass progressive shit, from police reform to tenant protections to climate legislation, has been really tremendous. And have they done enough? Absolutely not. Like, there's still so much more to do. But we've done a good job. But as we've been laser focused on the role of the state and the power that the state has in New York, I think that social movements focused on the city council and the mayor have really atrophied. And that's a challenge. So we need to really be able to be focused locally at the same time as we're focused on Albany. New York is a weak home rule state. That's just a fact. So a lot of powerful decisions actually happen in Albany. Andrew Cuomo's given us a masterclass in that. He spent 8 years dunking on de Blasio and making this job look terrible and saying, anything that you want to do, I'm going to come in and like fuck it up. So there's a little bit of the dynamic between the two of them that has made this job look really unappealing, and that has made organizers say, like, we're not going to focus here. I mean, there's a million examples. Stuff with the NYPD, stuff with the MTA, stuff, the plastic bag ban. You know, Andrew Cuomo is just always trying to come in and like muck up what's going on in Albany. So the left being really focused on the state legislature has been really successful for the left, but there's also been some consequences. The second sort of thing that I think is a lesson that really took us here is this question of like the legislative role versus the executive role. We've gotten really good at developing field programs and movements, outside movements that can knock on every door and motivate voters to vote in like a sort of relatively small, by comparison, state Senate district or state assembly district or even a congressional district. And in races like that, there are fewer people voting, and our mode is to get more people to vote and to get more people to vote for the young, exciting, progressive person. And we can scale up at that level. We haven't scaled up to the level of the executive. And some different things matter, right? There's a difference between staffing a 9-person state Senate office and staffing a tens of thousands of person like New York City government. And so I think voters are also sort of like looking for something different. They're looking for executive experience in a way that like isn't as important if you're going in to be a member of the legislature. And so as the left, we have people who see themselves as organizers. And if you're an organizer, being in the legislature is like very comfortable. We want to elect organizers, and we want organizers to say, like, I'm going into the state assembly, I'm going to get all my colleagues to sign on to my bill, and I'm going to pass my bill, and it's going to be awesome. We're going to be a check on the power of the executive. We're going to bring the people into government. We as the left, I think we're really comfortable in the legislature. And I think we're really uncomfortable in the role of like staffing a government, being the government, not being the opposition, literally executing the stuff. And so I think there's just something about this job, like the mayor's race or like the governor's race, that it's actually really hard to find someone who really actually wants to do that. It's not where we're comfortable, and it's maybe sort of different from like our theory of change as organizers and movement builders. It's so individualized, and we need to sort of get beyond that. And then I think the last point that I want to make, and I know I'm running up on my time, is that right now, as we're growing, and it's tremendous that we're growing, and we're growing fast, and we're especially growing with young people, and we're especially growing with young people of color. The truth is that working class people of color are kind of organized, who are such an important voting bloc in this election, are organized into more conservative institutions who are wanting to make safer bets than the new, young, really exciting left. And so institutions like 1199 and DC 37, or churches, right? Like big churches that have like deeper ties to the existing political establishment. We haven't made inroads yet into those voting blocs, and we really, really need to. Our institutions, DSA and our social movements, we're not as organized and representing we're not able to move blocks of votes in the same way as like the bigger unions are or the big churches are. And we need to be able to do that in order to win. So I actually feel like pretty hopeful about the city council. I think we're going to do a pretty good job there. And I think if all goes well, we'll have a really progressive speaker who can really take on standing up to the mayor, something that, Corey Johnson hasn't really done. Part of the reason why I think we are where we are is that Corey basically just like stopped doing anything, and the mayor kind of stopped doing anything, or just was so sort of incompetent and getting like stomped on by Cuomo. It's like, if you wanted to get something done as the left, you went to Albany. Like that's just was true for the last 4 years. City couldn't do anything. I think with competent leadership in the city council, with you know, maybe an oppositional relationship with the mayor can get our shit together a little bit more. But these dynamics are really important, and I'm really interested as the left grows and as we start to figure out how to like run stuff, what it would take to have a leftist executive. Who could that person be? What are the characteristics? What would it take to have like socialists running the housing agency just as much as we have like socialists being appointed to the state legislature? And that's just so important, our ability to implement the things that we legislate. So I really think it's the next growth edge for us right now.
Thank you so much, Sia, for offering this perspective. I actually very much like the framing of growing pains, right? Because I think it's also it's a way of making this, you know, like answering to this question of how we got here, but also it opens the door to thinking of, okay, so how, you know, how do we then position ourselves better, you know, so that this pain actually doesn't kill us, right? That we actually don't get sick because of this pain. Yeah, so I hope to actually get to that more closely shortly, but also something actually that I forgot to say in my long intro actually that is very, very important is that New York actually just adopted ranked choice voting in primary and special elections. So now starting, you know, June 22nd, voters can, you know, if they want to, rank up to 5 candidates in order of preference instead of choosing only one. So then in light of this, you know, scenario that we have been, you know, discussing so far, I also wonder what the possibilities and of course the limitations as well of ranked choice voting, and to what extent we should consider, we should factor ranked choice voting as we think about moving forward, as we think about this growing pain, as we think about, you know, what is to be done. So I think, Susan, you can situate us better on RCV, and also I'm sure that you also have other takes on the state of this election. So I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here and also to be on a panel with everyone here. And okay, so this is such an interesting election. Ranked choice voting is one of these things that has like a rich history, and a lot of that rich history is kind of forgotten. But basically, John Stuart Mill proposed this as part of electoral reform, but he wanted it to be done in multi-member districts, which would be the idea that you don't just vote for one, like city council person, you vote for like 5, and you rank order among the choices. And so New York actually did that as part of its progressive reforms in 1936, right? The 1930s, when we could have a few nice things, all right? So they had aldermen at the borough level. And this allowed for third-party candidates. This allowed for the first Black man, the first white woman to be elected as alder people within the city government. And it progressed along really nicely. Evidently, studies of this period show that there was like cross-partisan consensus around issues. Typically, bills at the city council would pass at like a rate of 80% agreement. And that it was like a really interesting time of collaboration and innovation at city government. And of course, we can never have nice things in this country because a Red Scare took that away. So basically, in 1947, ranked choice voting ended because, as those who feared it said, proportional representation and ranked choice voting would become a beachhead of communism in New York City. I always wish that what reactionaries said was actually true, but unfortunately, I couldn't find the beachhead anywhere in New York City. Okay, so that is just a really quick background to what ranked choice voting is. And it's now been divorced from the multi-member district, which is an important thing to keep in mind because the multi-member or proportional representation component allows for plurality representation. It allows for leftists. It allows for radicals. It allows for people who are more fringe. It allows for more representation of marginalized communities and their interests, right? So by divorcing ranked choice voting from proportional representation, we're taking away that ability to actually give voice to those who get washed out in majoritarian type systems. Okay, and also just to give you a little bit of history, Republicans loved ranked choice voting proportional representation in the 30s because they typically don't ever get majorities, but they were able to win more seats. So the alderman races, only when Republicans sided with sort of the anti-communist Democrats was there a sufficient push to end ranked choice and PR in New York City. Okay, now another piece of information that kind of gets lost in the discussions of ranked choice is that we already have runoff elections in New York City municipal elections. But by that, I don't mean like city council, but for the mayor, controller, public advocate, and I think that's it. All right, you have to get at least 40% of the votes in the primary to win the primary. Now, in 2013, famously, Letitia James and James Squadron faced each other in the public advocate race. That low turnout, runoff election cost between $10 to $13 million to administer. And just for reference, the public advocate's office then had a budget of $2.5 million. So people were like, perhaps it's not the best use of city resources. And then just like a little bit more information is that New York City municipal elections at the primary level tend to have pretty low turnout compared to other large cities. So in the 2013 primary election for mayor, in which Bill de Blasio barely eked out above 40%, but he did win by more than 10% over his opponent. About 21% of the registered Democrats voted. And now just another piece of information too is that since 2013, we've had an increase of registered Democrats in New York City, probably as a result of people, sort of the resistance crowd, the anti-Trump crowd, urging people to vote, and also progressives and socialists trying to get people to vote in Democratic primaries. So we have more Democrats now registered to vote. Okay, so in some ways, ranked choice voting seems like obvious because it sort of skips that step of having these really low turnout, high cost runoff elections in citywide primaries when no one candidate can win. So another thing too is that people who are sort of studying ranked choice voting, which is kind of having its moment, right? It's implemented in Maine, in a bunch of municipalities in California, in a bunch of municipalities in Minnesota, for example. People talk about how it's advantageous because ranked choice voting has kind of a moderating effect, right? So you can't have like a more radical or less majoritarian candidate win as you would in a single like first past the post kind of election, right? Let's say that like a socialist won 30%, but everybody else split up the rest of the vote. That won't happen in a ranked choice voting situation. And people say that that's popular for instances like a Donald Trump. Donald Trump has very strong support, but not very widespread, right? So among the Republican Party, the hardcore is like committed, but it's not like necessarily a very wide sector of the Republican voting bloc, which is why in the 2020 Democratic primaries, 5 states did use some kind of instant runoff type electoral system to have their primaries or the caucuses. So we're sort of at this political moment of like polarization. And also we're at this moment in which like I'm fascinated by like World Social Survey and all these other sort of public opinion polls that show like Gallup, et cetera, that Americans and people around the world are just sort of at very low levels of confidence for democracy, right? Across ages, especially young people. So if you look at the polling data, people are like, maybe a military strongman's not so bad, right? So we're at some of the lowest levels of democratic efficacy and confidence since like, what political scientists call the third wave of democratization, which starts in like the 70s and kind of like ends as Latin America and East Asia are democratizing in the late 80s. Okay, so I see ranked choice voting as kind of like a cheap reform to deal with low turnout and sort of political polarization, right? It's much easier to implement ranked choice voting than it is to address why people feel alienated or don't feel confidence in their political institutions. Okay, so some of the arguments against ranked choice voting include, right, so there's famously a lawsuit that got filed in December of 2020 by some of the leading members of the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus in the city council, including like Lori Cumbo and others, saying that we shouldn't have ranked choice voting for a number of reasons, including that conventional runoff systems tend to favor Black candidates, right? And this is referencing to Letitia James's victory in 2013, and that the Board of Elections really isn't in a very good position to implement reforms. That's something we could talk about in the Q&A. Our Board of Elections is not competent. It's not good at its job, and it's run by the state, not the city, which is another one of those reasons why, you know, traditionally we've been focusing on the state, because the state has a lot of power over the things that affect our lives. And then, of course, there were concerns that this would hurt, like ranked choice voting would be like too confusing to voters of color, like new Americans, that kind of thing. So there's definitely lots of research on ranked choice voting. Like, what does it look like? How do people feel about it? And I used to live in Minneapolis. So in 2013, Minneapolis had a mayoral election, which isn't a primary or anything like that. It just, nobody gets like an official nomination from a party, and they had 35 candidates running. And they had people ranked their candidates, and they had to have 33 rounds of votes before they picked Betsy Hodges. And even with those 33 rounds, she still only won like 49.5% of the electorate, because what happens is that people like kind of get fatigued. They don't vote all the way down. So you don't necessarily end up getting a majoritarian candidate. And it took like 2 days of voting and people were like real mad. But since then, Minneapolis voters, when they answer surveys, say that they are fine with our ranked choice voting. They don't mind it. They don't necessarily say they prefer it. And some of the studies include things that say that there isn't statistically significant evidence that Black, Latinx, Asian voters aren't able to understand RCV. Rather, if there's confusion about a ballot, it tends to reflect general demographic variations when it comes to comforts with voting. There probably is a little bit of a learning curve, right? So some of the reported data on San Francisco and Oakland elections shows that like Asian voters in Chinatown tend to be more likely to spoil a ballot on RCV than like Asians living outside of Chinatown, but that is something that doesn't go against general findings in like ballot data. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time at this point. So I'm just gonna pass it on. I think there's so many things left to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah, I'm definitely interested in hearing more of that, because actually there is an entire debate on whether, you know, we are actually making procedural changes, you know, or whether we are actually addressing problems of our, you know, democratic system, you know, or this change, are we actually fetishizing some of these changes, as you know, as they have like maybe power to address some of the underlying, you know, shortcomings of our society, broadly speaking, which is like, for example, the disenfranchisement of voters, or the fact that, you know, that institutions are not responsive to people's, you know, demands or things like that. I definitely want to pick that up. And also hear whatever else you had to share on this election per se, on the state of the race. But I actually want to hear from you, Tony, what is, you know, your visions here as someone who has been in New York for a while, and I guess, you know, has maybe, you know, how you are experiencing this, you know, news cycle.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm thrilled to be on this panel, mostly to learn from Susan and Sia, who I feel like know local politics more, you know, much better than I do. I think if I have any value, it's because like I'm the old head on that panel, right? Sort of. So I mean, partly I'm gonna talk from that perspective. I also wanted to thank you, Nara, for starting off, with the question of the pandemic, which in some ways it's weird how little that has sort of come up in the election. And you and I were actually co-teaching a class on racial capitalism, like in the early days of the lockdown. So for many ways, like I'd like to sort of, bring back some of the framing and some of the discussions that we sort of were having then. But let me do just a minute on like long view. I'm probably not even gonna use my 10 minutes because I kind of want to hear more from, other folks. This is more just like having lived, like if you were like me and you came of age politically in the 90s, the mayor, we had a Republican mayor of New York for basically 2 decades, starting in 94, and not just any Republican, but Rudy Giuliani, right? So, right, Rudy. We had a Republican governor for a decade, starting in 1995. And, back to Susan's point about like, you could have nice things in the 30s for like a minute, post World War II, the Republicans controlled the state Senate for 75 years. And even when they didn't anymore because of the IDC, they essentially did, right? So, part of my thinking, and I to prepare for this, I spent a certain amount of time listening to like the Wonkosphere, the 538 and sort of like, right. Part of what's interesting to me is hearing about this notion of like New York as this kind of bastion of progressive politics. And it's like that, like maybe to some extent recently that's true, but I mean, there's not that kind of longer history. And I think, Cuny is a good way of marking that. Having taught at Cuny since 2005, I know Susan is a Cuny colleague. I mean, Cuny has been utterly battered by austerity politics for 50 years. I mean, just utterly undermined. And to some extent has been undermined from the moment that it desegregated, because it was an almost entirely segregated institution up until the beginnings of the 1970s. When that desegregation comes and when open admissions come is precisely when austerity begins. So, part of what for me is like a little bit vertigo inducing hearing is sort of this notion of like New York as the bastion of progressive politics is like, that's actually not the long history. And I think that's part of, that's important, I think, for sort of setting the stage for the moment. The other thing that really strikes me listening to the kind of like wonk view, like there's a certain way in which the New York, like the takeaway of the New York electoral election is like, oh, the moderates are winning. And there's a kind of continuation of this discourse, which really to some extent has been going on since the 2020 election, like, oh, the left with their defund the police sort of like lost the moderates. And like, there's a bunch of things that we could say about that. And I mean, to some extent, the wonks are gonna say what the wonks are gonna say. I don't think the left has to sort of necessarily win over the wonks. But just in terms of, the kind of, it's, to me, it's really striking. I'll put this out. I don't know if this is true or not. My impression is that there's a tendency when there's progressive gains to sort of write them off as local, sort of like local happenings. I mean, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won, when Jamal Bowman won, I feel like I saw the same kinds of comments, which was like, well, these were sort of demographic changes in the community, and it really had more to do with that. It doesn't really indicate like any kind of ideological shift in voters. It's more just demographics. But then when basically like no polling, because almost no one is polling this election because for reasons, partly because of ranked choice, based on almost no polling, it sort of seems like a few moderates are ahead. It's like, oh, well, that is clearly an indicator of like ideological shifts in the electorate. So, I mean, I think we should sort of beware of that sort of sense of like, the way this election is sort of going to be talked about and the way it's going to be put into these kind of larger questions. Sia really already talked about the city council election as, for me, I mean, I think we've agreed like that they're like, I don't think anyone on the left is excited about the mayoral election. And I think we're just trying to live through it. But, there is something I think really important. And the fact that, 35 of the 51 seats are open contested seats because of term limits. Like it really is going to be a major turnover. And I guess I would put this as a question more than anything, to you both. And I mean, see, I was really struck by the way you were talking about this sort of notion of like the left's relationship to like the executive, like the sort of executive positions. whether there could be a kind of specific strategy of, sort of downsizing the power of executives, right? I mean, if that could actually be, I mean, in addition to sort of seizing the executive seat, which I think is something that has to happen, like we've essentially had, with the exception of de Blasio, if you think back to like Ed Koch, Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg, like essentially just really kind of powerful individual figures, and then a city council that no one probably even knew who their city councilor was in most cases. So, whether there could be a kind of shift in the political culture away from the sort of executive as the center. I mean, that's a question. I honestly don't know. Susan really already came at this question of ranked choice voting. It was interesting. I listened to the 538 podcast to prepare, and they were all like bemoaning the fact that no one's doing polling, and no one's doing polling because no one knows how ranked choice voting is going to work, and no one wants to be wrong. So, I mean, at the same time as they were saying like, oh, clearly the moderates are going to win, it's like, that's based on nothing. Like, because essentially, I don't think anyone really has a sense of exactly how things are going to play out. One thing just to throw out, and I mean, I think this goes, I mean, Susan, your point about Minneapolis, it's probably going to be the case that we're not going to know who wins the primary until like into July, like probably well into July. My understanding is that the Board of Elections is not even going to sort of go to the ranked choice votes if no one gets 40% for like a week after the election. And the Board of Elections being what it is, they're going to totally mess it up. So, I mean, there's going to be probably an interesting moment of like absolute confusion before a kind of winner emerges. Maybe that's all I'll say on that. I guess I want to sort of end more on a kind of question. And I mean, like I sort of came in thinking like I'm going to do sort of glass half full. But I think, Sia, you did a much better job of that by talking about this as the kind of growing pain. And I think like that was really like well put. I guess I will maybe ask or put out there as a point of discussion. I mean, Brendan West, who's a member of, Kings County Democrat, who's one of the sort of leaders in the ranked choice voting, also one of the leaders of sort of Occupy City Hall, who's running for, city council in my district. So I've sort of gotten to know him as a candidate. But one of the things he's written about is the extent to which things like ranked choice voting get seen as sort of gentrified. And I mean, to some extent, I think this is a thing that DSA has had to sort of face as well, like the kind of like the left as a kind of gentrify, not as a kind of like organic force in New York, but rather as this kind of gentrifying force. So, I mean, maybe I would just want to raise that as a question or a point of discussion. I mean, it comes up around ranked choice, but it comes up around a lot of other things as well. And, in addition to the question, of sort of making inroads into these communities, how to sort of deal with that kind of perception, right? And I guess, I mean, going all the way back to Nara's opening point about how did we get here, like, I get that every mayoral election is probably going to be about like law and order and crime, and like that's just like the playbook and the script. But like, I can't help but think like, 1 year ago, even de Blasio was forced to have to pretend to cut $1 billion from the NYPD budget, right? Because of movements, basically. So how did we get in 1 year? Like, what exactly happened that we got from that to where we are now, where according to, like, if you read any article about the debates, it's like, this is an election about crime, not policing, but like sort of crime. And even in terms of things like, the increase in anti-Asian violence, the increase in kind of racial, like that has somehow gotten put under the category of crime, right? Whereas it feels like the moment of Black Lives Matter was sort of talking about, structural racism and state violence, right? Somehow that has gotten sort of shifted over into this other category. So I think it's a question that's probably larger than this election, but I really kind of maybe want us to ask, like, what exactly happened in that discourse, right? And how do we kind of reclaim some of that ground? So I've got more questions than answers, but I'm maybe going to end it there, and maybe we can talk some more about some of that stuff.
Thank you so much, Tony. I guess a lot of people have more questions than answers, and I think that's the good thing. You know, it actually is a good thing that we have more questions here. I actually I thank you for bringing this this memory of New York in the 90s, and having actually, you know, mentioning the reactionary politics, you know, the kind of conservative, let's say, just put this way, conservative politics that we would see in the state and at the city level. I think this bringing in this broad picture, long-term perspective is super important, and I actually want to start my comments from there. I actually want to highlight that something that didn't come up in this conversation, but that this year, in this fall, more precisely, is the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And there is no question to me that Occupy Wall Street had a fundamental contribution to the activist movement scene that we have in the city today. Obviously, you cannot trace everything back to Occupy. That's not exactly how, you know, movement analysis actually works. But the shift, you know, from a New York like this Rudy Giuliani, you know, situation, Mike Bloomberg situation, to, you know, a New York where the left has a stronger voice, does owe to Occupy to some extent. Bill de Blasio, you know, our current mayor, actually rode the Occupy wave, and Occupy formed a lot of activists and cracked the ideological legitimation aura around neoliberalism. So I think that that's really very important to point out. And I'm not going to get into details here, but I should say that actually Occupy attracted people with different political backgrounds and was more political heterogeneous than it's usually remember. And for, you know, part of the folks that were there, the absence of some sort of program or even like demands, if you want to put it in this way, like there was a very, you know, contentious debate internally. The movement was actually a shortcoming, right? And many folks then turned in this post-Occupy moment into organizing specific movements while seeking for some sort of concreteness, right? Let's, you know, say it this way, like that Occupy actually to them missed. And then a few years into this, you had Trump's election, right? The right wing fully out there, and then a new wave of people, you know, stepping into activism alongside a vision that political offices are not only important but necessary, right? And of course, you know, the Bernie campaign very much inspired this vision. So I think these two trends that I briefly referred to here, like these lessons from Occupy, that, you know, movement that, you know, swept the country, but was, you know, strong here in New York, and, you know, these lessons from Occupy that then cross, you know, with the effort to respond to reactionaries, right? I would say pushed the left more, like broadly speaking, towards like the idea of like tangible gains, right? So, and I think this is actually very important. I'm not questioning the importance of tangible gains, but also, as you know, as part of this panel, you know, is you know, this emerging all the time, you know, being this position of advancing institutionally, right, is tricky, right? The growing pains, right? So we have, how do we actually, you know, how do we manage this institutional advancement? And I actually highlight three aspects that to me are very important when thinking about this strictness, right? Like the three reasons why I think that being this position of advancing institutionally is challenging, right? And I think here the first putting, like, first more broadly, once in office, there is actually a thin line between making gains, for the sake of making gains and like keeping that office, that position, and making gains towards transformative change, right? So, and why am I saying that? Because, as Sia mentioned, Tony mentioned, we are, even if the mayoral race looks depressing, right? Landing some city council seats is almost certain, I would say. We are actually, there is a very strong chance, as Sia said, I'm a progressive speaker. We are actually, we are going to have this turnout, and some progressives will be in the city council. So then I think something important to think about is, okay, so what are these seats for? What does the left want to achieve with them? And I think that, this it's important to actually revisit this question, not only to highlight, bullet points of changes that we actually, of things that are in the program, but always to reflect on, are these items, let's say, in our agenda, pointing out to changes that, are also, in direction of transformative change, or just, some reform, superficial stuff that, and that's it. So, I think actually it's important to revisit this question, so then we are not trapped in what I like to call incrementalism, like short-term perspectives. What actually we are, what are going to be, what is the role of this, progressive members that are, going to step in very likely in the city council. And also, I think here the second reason that I think it's that advancing institutionally is tricky is that achievements in this, in this arena are not necessarily a perfect translation, a perfect reflection of the correlation of forces and of our actual leverage, right? And I think here that speaking to some extent to your question, Tony, I think that the performance of Eric Adams and Andrew Yang, I think it speaks much more, speaks a lot to that. I also wonder, because something that I have here in my notes is that if the momentum that was, that we got over this past year, and especially over the summer, has been translated into a compelling society project, or if we are still, so then we don't get disappointed, oh, let's assess which stage exactly we are, and I think here, because I think it's important that we don't mistake mobilization for ideological cultural change, right? So mobilization is one thing, is a very important step, but it's not the same thing of actually having cultural change. So then I would say that question that I mentioned at the beginning, so how do we get here? I would also, I would reframe that to say okay, what are we missing, to make this leap from mobilization to ideological / cultural change. Because then it's an invitation to think about how rooted the left is, and I very much agree with Sia that there are some areas that we can make that we can advance in some segments, in some sectors that we actually can advance. And then actually something that I think it's important in terms of some the trickiness of advancing in the institutional arena is actually because this means that we have to consider also the moves of other political actors. And I think here that what we have with Andrew Yang and Eric Adams is very telling. And I read both Yang and Adams, especially Eric Adams, as encapsulating attempts of recomposing the democratic party, right? I see at the local level a process that somewhat replicates what happened nationally, like some mainstream forces rally behind an old familiar figure in order to block, the influence of contesting voices and keeping, the party more aligned with its old, shape. So Andrew Yang, okay, started with, this funny guy, not funny really, but more with this, some different proposals, but actually his, his nod to the real estate, his partnership with Bloomberg's old campaign manager actually don't hide where his interest is, where his allegiance actually stands. But actually, to me, Eric Adams is actually a very interesting figure, and I think like he has it all, right? When it comes to this orchestrated, like a somewhat of a comeback of traditional Dem alliance. So he's supported by some of the borough's current presidents. He has a lot of representatives behind him that are not friendly to the left wing of the Democratic Party. His super PAC is very much robust. And he also has, some big labor unions behind him, with him, that expect, some concessions, and that might actually become a barrier to the efforts of the progressive sector should he become, the mayor. But obviously there is actually a very important difference in this rough comparison that I made with the national level, because Joe Biden, right, who actually made this unification, this recomposition of the Democratic Party, had to do some, symbolic concessions to the left in the progressive segment, right? I think it's symbolic because I don't think that there was, any substantial change in this national, in this administration, but this is not actually where we would have with either like an Adams or a Yang. There would be no nod to the left at all, like at all. So and even like Andrew Yang, some people say, oh, but he's like an outsider, he might be some like malleable, like no. And I think that who actually saw the debate yesterday could see that very clearly. Eric Adams made crystal clear that he thinks that the solution to the city is like the perfect neoliberal formula, like capital plus cops, right? And Andrew Yang is not going to go much, different from that. So then in the end, the so-called moderates actually can open, the way to even like more conflict, because their agenda will come with no room to the progressive sector cultivated in the city over this past years. So, so then, I would also think about that, like, are we, how we, the left, would prepare for that? Like, can we counter this push should we have, either of these figures as mayor? And if so, how, right? Not sure if my take is happy, but things that I think it's important to consider in this conversation as well. Yeah, so I'm not sure if any of you want to come back to some of the points that were actually made.
Could I ask a question just coming out of your last point?
Yeah.
Because I mean, in some ways, I think it goes back to some of the things that, I mean, both Sia and Susan were saying, but especially Sia about state politics. Like, is there a way, almost like a roundabout way, to take some comfort in the fact that we've seen how effectively Albany can block a mayor?
Mm-hmm.
If we have, in fact, like right-leaning mayor, but enough purchase in Albany, can we in fact use that as a way to sort of cancel out that power?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting question, although I think some of these same things that are coming up in the mayoral election will come up in the governor's election next year. And so I think we need to, not get caught flat-footed there again. And then I don't know. I mean, I think this sort of question of like police and real estate and the neoliberal city is a really it's a really important one that actually does have to be tackled at the state level, though. I mean, I work in housing, and so when you have that perspective, you really can think about like how the hands of the mayor are truly tied, because a mayor's interest is always going to be an increasing property. Even if you want to like pay for Cuny or pay for public schools or pay for the MTA, a mayor is tied in their ability to raise revenue or raise taxes, except in one thing. The one thing that they can do is rely on property tax revenue to fund our cities. And so that means that we're in this like sort of like vicious cycle. Mayors are inherently in a vicious cycle where they actually need the city to gentrify, because they need the property tax values to increase, because they need to do that to pay for whatever social program you might need or want. And so, you know, what Bill de Blasio did was he, one, like tried to drive up property taxes in certain parts of the city, try to like bring private investment through rezoning to places like East New York and places like the South Bronx and places like the North Shore of Staten Island. You know, and that's like a sort of like calculated thing. What Bloomberg did is he tried to like turn manufacturing zones into really luxury housing. And then, you know, UPK, what de Blasio did is he got the state to pass UPK. He like pushed hard. The state is paying for UPK, not the city. And so the question of a neoliberal city really, to me, also just comes back to like property and property taxes and how overly reliant on economic development and gentrification our cities are in order to fund any single social service. It's sort of a trap. I'm not really sure how you would get out of it. But that doesn't mean that the person who's in charge of our public schools and in charge of our public housing and in charge of the NYPD doesn't matter. It's incredibly consequential, but they just need to be a really good manager and organizer, grounded in a deep belief in the public sector and a deep commitment to, you know, winning things in Albany. One thing I wish that de Blasio had done better, for example, is like, instead of having like disdain for the mayor of Buffalo and the mayor of Albany and the mayor of Rochester and the mayor of Syracuse, like they could like organize and gang up on the governor and like fight to raise taxes at the state level. And that never happened.
I'd like to comment on a couple of things that have been said. So one of the things that some friends and I are talking about, like, should you rank like Yang or Adams, knowing that the two of them are likely to be the frontrunners. And then to do that, you have to sort of engage in this like reverse Sophie's choice, like you hate them both, and which one do you hate less, right? And so one of the things that I think about is they're both neoliberal, but in my mind, Eric Adams like will have a little bit more of like a begrudging acceptance of our public sector. As somebody who is a public servant and has endorsements from public sector unions, I don't think that he'll have the sort of Bloomberg type attempt to not fund union contracts. He won't be transformative, but I think that, for example, a Yang presidency, thank God no Yang presidency, but Yang mayoralty would be one in which we might see, for example, an attempt to create a New Orleans style privatization of public schools, because, you know, as Yang's whole thing as sort of an outsider candidate is creating a winning coalition of reactionaries. And so one of the things that he's done very well is recognize the reactionary response of white professional, but not exclusively white, professional working parents who are really furious about school closings for COVID. They have an incredibly unimaginative understanding of what public responsibility should be in that moment. Absolutely no solidarity with teacher unions in a way that reverses the solidarity wave for teacher strikes that we've seen in previous years. And it's frankly very scary because these people are my social peers. And some of them are also public sector workers. So that's been very interesting. And, you know, Yang has squarely blamed the union and has put himself in opposition with public sector workers. And I think that as like a techie sort of Silicon Valley kind of guy, I, by the way, didn't know he was from New York. I assumed he was from the Bay Area. would see disrupting public sector provisions as being like one of these hallmarks of his mayoral, I guess his mayoralty, which I find more disruptive and frightening in some ways. If we're thinking about the ways that public sector employment creates opportunities for middle class, a gateway to the middle class for so many working class, immigrant, and communities of colors here in New York City, I think that that's potentially incredibly disruptive, with the understanding, of course, that Eric Adams is also going to militarize our, police even more so, and put more, like, so he's not going to shut down the public schools, but we put more cops in them, So this is such a horrible decision to make. And the thing is that I fought, don't do this, it's a waste of time. I fought with Andrew Yang text makers who text make me, and I'm like, oh, he hates unions. And they can never, they'll lie about all kinds of things. They'll lie and say Andrew Yang created UBI or whatever, but they won't lie to me about this because they know that it's out there, that's very public, how much he disdains teachers unions, how much he disdains the public sector. And this is something that, I'm thinking about a lot these days.
I just want to, I'm so glad you raised that point. And I mean, watching, coming out of the debate last night, I mean, the role, for example, of like the charter school, sort of like the charter school lobbies in this election, right, for both Yang and I mean, we haven't talked about Catherine Garcia, who I could sort of imagine for some people is going to be like the poison pill, where it's like, if you don't want to rank either Adams or Yang, you maybe rank Garcia and hope that she'll sort of come through the middle. But I mean, the way the public schools were being talked about, like, we've lost a year to the pandemic, they're failing our children. Like, it does start to sound like the kind of disaster capitalism scenario that, in New Orleans led to, right, a kind of total privatization. So, I mean, there's a way in which the stage is set for that. And I mean, that is a real scenario that I think we need to sort of, get out in front of. And I completely agree. I mean, Yang was talking about like deficits yesterday, right? I mean, it's like he's really sort of trying to take up that hawk position, I think.
Yeah, actually, I think this, I want to mention again this question about, so should we rank, Adams or Yang, the ballot, etc. Because I actually think it's, this highlights, that in the end, my take on ranked choice voting, I'm not sure what you folks, would think. Thank you. And by the way, thank you, Susan, for this fascinating background on the ranked choice voting. And I actually wonder if, dissociating this, the way that ranked choice voting is, was set here from this way of a multi-member district, proportional representation, etc. If that actually affects, in the end, it becomes some sort of like, it doesn't solve any of our problems, and in the end, we are here thinking about, okay, so how do we, we are not going to be able to address the fact that we don't have a strong, leftist candidate, etc. Because we have, with ranked choice voting is not going to help us in any way. So, but in the end, what sort of a calculation do you think that that is presented to the left when we have to rank people? Is that any sort of thing to consider? Is that anything that is some way? Is this something that we have to factor in our when we go to the ballot, ranking people or not?
I mean, I think
we don't need to rank, right? That's what
so you're saying, you don't have to fill out 5.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to, it's a genuine question. It's like a genuine question, we don't have to feel.
Yeah, and I don't know how it would play out. I don't know enough about it. That's a really good question. I want to sort of echo, I think, Susan's point about Yang being very into union, and I think sort of related to that point, I think a lot of times a sort of a liberal take here is that because Yang has no ties to existing democratic institutions, really, you know, he's got the Bloomberg campaign manager, but Bloomberg himself was sort of like an iconoclast, like not really like not connected to the city and its political institutions. I think it's a sort of a liberal take that's a good thing, right? Like we should like go with, if we have to choose between Yang and Adams, we should go with Yang because like he's movable. He has no ties. He could
Malleable.
win. Malleable. Yeah. You know, I actually think that's like incredibly dangerous.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
it means that he's not accountable to a single thing. And, you know, the left has gotten okay and is getting better at trying to force existing institutions to bend to our will. You know, this is just a really dumb small example, but like the example of progressives, you know, breaking the Kings County political county committee and sort of just like going in and just like completely embarrassing and taking over and really forcing rules changes in Kings County Dems. Eric Adams, because he's like tied to these institutions and he has to be, it's like he's staked his entire career being tied to these institutions. I mean, we could probably learn how to play that game, you know, and there's like some sort of way that there are institutions and movements and groups that we have access to that we could figure out how to leverage to get him to do something. And so it's not just that he's anti-union, it's that he's like accountable to, and I don't want to rank Eric Adams. Like I hate even that I'm saying this, right? But I do think that this question of like, he's malleable, he doesn't have those ties. Like those ties are actually what we can use as leverage as organizers. Those ties are actually deeply important. The fact that Yang came out of nowhere is really dangerous. And I think it's sort of just like a liberal perception of politics to assume that like that's something to be desired.
Yeah, thank you.
Have we more or less kind of conceded that it will be?
I don't think we should.
I'm just wondering. I'm just putting.
No, I don't think we should.
Conversation. I mean, imagine someone listening and be like, I don't like. I mean, I'm asking because I really don't know. I mean, there's the numbers game seems to be like, oh, no progressive candidate is viable right now. But again, that seems to be based on almost nothing in terms of like polling or in terms of actual like factual information. Yeah, so it's more, I think like I could imagine somebody asking like, does Scott Stringer have a chance? Does Diane Morales have a chance? Does Maya Wiley have a chance? Like we haven't really talked about any of them as candidates.
Yeah, I actually think that this, yeah, I mean, like calling, the results is like, it's not possible. And I'm not even sure if this is, what we can do here. But something that I think, I think the question is, these candidates are in the spotlight. Eric Adams is in the spotlight. Andrew Yang is in the spotlight, and now Catherine Garcia is in the spotlight. So then I would reframe this question. Okay, like, oh, did we consider there's going to be them? I mean, no. I mean, maybe not. But the point is, where are the self-proclaimed progressives? In this, and I'm saying self-proclaimed because there is a whole, debate on whether these campaigns, have some sort of organic ties with movements. But yeah, I wonder like why we actually didn't speak about the campaigns of Diane Morales and Scott Stringer. Which I don't know, I would actually, we missed this one, but we can always catch this train, that is actually presented here. So in the end, why, we have these campaigns are, in this array as well. So yeah, so I actually would like, if anyone has a take on this, these two campaigns that in the end, yeah, that actually present themselves as as progressives, the progressive voice in this race.
I mean, Diane Morales, like I don't know what to say about Diane Morales. I actually like it. like Andrew Yang, a completely inauthentic representation of like left words. Like her her like platforms, everything she's saying, it's just like leftist like word salad smushed together, thrown onto a website with like a pretty color on the background. Like that, the campaign always lacked substance to me. And now we're seeing the consequences of having a campaign that lacks substance. We have worked on campaigns on the left that have weathered tremendous scandal, right? Like it was when, like, let's look at the Julia Salazar campaign, for example. It was a media like shitstorm, and it was tremendously difficult for the people on the campaign. But the move, because Julia is out of the movement and like is real, the response that we had and the response that the left had was not like abandoning ship 3 weeks before the election. It was like, we're closing ranks, we're protecting the candidate, we're protecting our movement, and we're going to win this thing. And we did. And so that response to me is so different. And so like what's happening here with the Morales campaign, it just shows just when your support is on the left is really only an inch deep, like it can disappear very quickly.
I want to say something about Scott Stringer, which is not to evaluate claims of legitimacy of anything. I'm not a legal scholar or an investigator, but rather, I guess this kind of reflects some of the things that Sia was saying, is that, you know, as a person who's been alive, norms have changed of appropriate behavior, of how people interact for the better, you know, undoubtedly. The kinds of behavior that are appropriate for, you know, older people, men, bosses, whatever, have changed dramatically. And we all stand by those changes, and we denounce these violations and abuses, particularly as they happen right now in real time by someone like Andrew Cuomo, who has passed laws about sexual harassment, has had an aide do the sexual harassment training that that, you know, Tony and I have to do as state employees. Okay, so on one hand, this is a wonderful development. On the other hand, we don't have norms on how to evaluate these violations in the past, right? So one of my friends was making a joke about how like Austin Powers was once a thing, like a multi-million-dollar film franchise. And the whole thing is about very inappropriate behaviors in professional settings. And then a main character, frankly, getting away with it, becoming more popular and beloved by people around it, right? And so you would never make an Austin Powers movie today. And the kinds of behavior that were alleged against Scott Stringer would never be acceptable today. But this was during the, you know, the Austin Powers time. So how do we evaluate that behavior? And then people who are on the left, particularly, you know, people, which include me, who want to have not a punitive approach towards, you know, when people make mistakes, right? Including people who get caught up in the criminal justice system, and want to have, right, and I try to do this with my own kids, which is not how I was raised, right? A restorative, you know, approach towards injustices. Don't apply this to cancellations. And of course, a young man who might shoplift is very different than Scott Stringer in 2001, but at the same time, right, if we say that people make mistakes, then we should recognize that people should have, that we should have a process for those who want to address these mistakes. Of course, it's very different if someone says, you know, this behavior is okay, right? And, you know, this person is just being whatever. But, you know, and I'm not saying this necessarily relates to Scott Stringer. I'm just saying that, you know, moving forward, we will find candidates who have engaged in behavior that are no longer appropriate for our current context. But, you know, this current standards that we use, are they effective? Are they not? And I mean, I don't have the answers to this. These are just questions I'm posing.
That makes me want to, because I was thinking about Stringer after the debate last night. That makes me want to ask a kind of, you know, like go a little bit to where Sia was going. I mean, part of what I was wondering last night was like, would Stringer really, how competitive would Stringer have been even without the harassment charges, right? Given the relative lack of you know, ties to movements, which I think, you know, I mean, clearly it's a different situation than Morales. But in other words, was some of the sort of quick movement away from him similar to the sort of quick movement away? In other words, I don't know, it's really just a question, like how competitive would he have been even with, right? I mean, even without the allegations. I mean, it's a general question. I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And I also wonder, I mean, I really wonder about our ability as the left to move blocks of votes at the level that we need to make an impact to win these races. Like, in some ways, the Stringer thing is like a test balloon. Like, what impact is this going to have with voters? Like, they don't know. They haven't heard of this guy. They're not reading. I mean, the Stringer thing feels like it happened 100 years ago, the scandal. So I don't, you know, in a legislative race, we know how to win those. We like talk to more voters than everybody. We do it again. We talk to them, and then we do a second pass, and then we do a third pass, and we win. In like a mayoral election, when you can't scale up at that level, like who's moving the blocks of votes to make a really big impact? And like, what is it? It's not really left movements. So I don't know. I think it might be late. I think labor has a real role to play. And by and large, labor didn't walk away from the Stringer campaign. Mostly it was like the community groups and the Working Families Party and some politicians.
Yeah, I cannot answer either of these questions. I think like we cannot, you know, we don't know. It's not possible to figure out, you know, how this actually impact if he would be a competitive candidate. But you know, something to speak more concretely to what Susan mentioned, I think in the end, yes, I'm actually very interested in thinking, you know, about, I don't have an answer either, but I'm actually very interested in thinking about, you know, enacting different approaches, you know, to actually handle, you know, more restorative, you know, justice, you know, perspectives and, you know, frameworks in our organizing, like across, you know, the board, you know, like we cannot like do this like in some levels and then not doing the others. But then we are also faced with another issue, which is how actually in the end, you know, I spent some time like talking about like the trickiness of, you know, offices, you know, institutional, the institutional arena, etc. In the end, I also wondered, like, to what extent, you know, even these institutions are actually friendly to, you know, the type of correlational forces that we have to manage, the type of effort that we have to put together. To what extent this is actually friendly, you know, and compatible to practices that we carry in our movements, you know, that we think about, you know, like how do we, you know, go around that? Because as you correctly said, this is going to come up again, you know, like this type of issue will come up again. And I mean, not even to discuss like this specific case, we have to have in mind, you know, that this is a problem that we will face, you know, with unfortunately we will face again. So or our, you know, is this, so then in the end we actually, you know, I actually wrote down the question that you know, that Tony made, like maybe like downsizing, you know, the executive as a strategy for the left, you know, like diminishing the role, you know, a broad, like long-term, like super long-term strategy, you know, for the left, in a way that we actually can somewhat, you know, go around the weight of an individual figure, you know, which has become a barrier even for like raising like a candidate, for example, raising a name. Let me just check here. Yeah, so I'm going to the audience. Okay, yeah, so I actually, Justin has a question that speaks a little bit like that says a little bit about what, like a question that Tony himself made. So he says Eric Adams and Ray McGuire are, as candidates, feels like a reflection of social and at the time political conservatism of Black voters like Sia mentioned. What tactics do you envision as a way for people of color to vote more along their interests and join issue campaigns that directly affect them without the feeling of tokenization? I've been to rallies and seen mostly white folks in the attendance, even though these rallies benefit working class in general and people of color specifically. How do we combat the connection between democratic socialism and gentrifiers? Is this actually, I actually want to question this, like, do we see even this frame, but it's actually an important question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the labor organizing is, I think we should, a couple things. One, organizing CUNY students is really important. It's a public institution made up of mostly young, working class people of color, and organizing like a free CUNY could be a real way to do this. And I think something that's just worth saying is that there is a divide between like, there's a generational divide. You know, I think like young people of color are a lot more open to don't vote conservatively at the same degree as older folks. And so I don't know. I think CUNY is a really good opportunity. I think organizing a block of votes in public housing would be really very, very, very cool. And trying to do things like taking over the NYCHA TAs with NYCHA residents who, you know, identify as socialists or with democratic socialism as like a value. I think the public sector unions are really important too, and trying to, you know, support like radical or progressive caucuses. There's something like DC 37 progressives. We're getting involved in that would be very, very cool. So there's lots of different, I think, paths. But I do think this path of, you know, you try to do like community organizing and just identify one or two spokespeople is not the right one. Because we haven't seen that works to actually like have followers who want to join institutions and support. I also think that the right candidate matters too. No, I was going to say the right candidate matters too, right?
So I just want to say a couple things. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I was, you know, with other people in DSA and other sort of activists, you know, we were part of her early supporters, which was very lonely. And what we found was that working class, Latinx, communities of colors, the older people, they went for Crowley. If you look at sort of the breakdowns on the votes. But then by the time 2020 emerges, everybody loves her, right? So the people who voted for Crowley now love AOC. They're so happy to have like a representative who talks about issues that relate to them and looks like them, or, you know, one of their daughters or something like that. And the young people already love her. So one of the things that we see is that this the relationship building, winning matters, right? Because incumbency advantage matters quite a lot. And being able to be present in communities as an elected official matters a lot. And so even if AOC wasn't elected by older working class people, you see that her victory ended up developing these relationships and building the trust that is often needed to get these sort of triple prime older voters of color who matter so much in New York City politics. And so that, I think that was very informative to me, looking at the way the votes changed over time. And then of course, like talking to people, you know, saying, oh, blah, 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 AOC. And then, you know, people, I live in the district, like their faces lighting up, you know, I love AOC, and telling me why they love AOC. You know, people like my children's babysitter, for example. So that's sort of one thing as well. The DSA has a group called Religion and Socialism, in which people who have faith, which doesn't include me, are trying to build relationships with faith institutions and with priests and ministers and that kind of thing, in communities that we want to reach, by sort of just saying, here's what we do, particularly the kind of mutual aid work we do. Is there a way that we could be helpful to build that trust? So that way, DSA doesn't just seem like a bunch of weird outsiders or gentrifiers, but rather people who are embedded in the community. So I feel like there's creative ways, in addition to like labor unions, that you can build trust. And I think ultimately, right, like for a long time, these communities of colors voted for white politicians and trusted them. And now they vote for like politicians of color and trust them. I feel like what matters more than anything else is history and trust, and not just demographics. And so being present in a community matters quite a lot. And trying to reach these communities where we don't have like a large number of voters is going to take new tactics. But for example, a few of us who spoke like Mandarin, Cantonese, and Korean, and I don't speak it very well, did some canvassing for Tiffany Gabon in 2019 in parts of Flushing. And we didn't do that much. And we didn't do that well. But we were there. And it was an assembly district that she almost won. And then we also went back to do canvassing for Bernie Sanders. And so we were going back to buildings where we already been, going back to communities where we'd already been. So we were no longer just totally newcomers and strangers, but we sort of like were familiar with the territory. So we're not doing it scaling up to the way we need to, but we're definitely trying to make these inroads.
Maybe I'll just say very quickly. I mean, thanks to Justin for the question. Just a second, Sia's point about organizing at Cuny, and I remember there was like a minute when there was kind of a debate, like, should the left be organizing among students? Should the left be organizing around workers? And I'm like, come to Cuny, you can organize both, right? Because every student at Cuny is also a worker, right? So I mean, I think in terms of the kind of generational divide, also, students talk to their families. I mean, I think like the influence, like sort of like the notion that like there's a generation that we can't reach, or that we, reaching one generation doesn't mean it's to the exclusion of reaching another. But maybe I would just add, as someone who, has been deeply inspired by the DSA, because I had more or less to some extent written off electoral politics. And I think a lot of, and that would be true, I think, across generations in a lot of these communities. It certainly is true for many of my students, where, when Bernie was running the first time, I had students who would show up with Bernie buttons. I'd be like, are you registered to vote? And I'm not going to vote. So I mean, and again, I mean that your point about like winning matters. I mean, this is like, as that translates into actual like policies and changes that they see in their lives, as it translates into like a free Cuny, for example, right, which is slowly sort of making its way, like the sort of allies in the legislature are slowly pushing that forward. But I do think that there still needs to be, in some circles, like especially among younger activists, like the case of like, okay, yeah, it actually does matter. Like there is actually avenues within electoral politics that matter. I still have to convince myself of that some days.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you for this. For this concrete, actually, suggestions, because I think sometimes we do so much, we offer so much and I speak that, I do that a lot, like speak so much in more abstract terms. And I very much appreciate like bringing this, concrete ideas. And this speaks a lot to a comment that was also in the Facebook that asked for ideas on how the left can actually then make, be more integrated, in the communities. And I think that here, let's always remember, also echoing something that Justin mentioned in his comment, that in the end, yeah, the rallies might be some, by looking one way, but the rallies are just a tiny part of the effort of the left, and we also have, and then like going, slowly doing the work of being connected to organizations that are already doing the work, even if not necessarily, immediately aligned with what we are, proposing, or thinking of ways of offering concrete, um, um, organizing proposals to them, like for example, for Cuny, or things around housing, etc. It can be a way to go and make this, break this association that has been made between like leftist progressives and gentrifiers, right? So
I also think that also is a political attack. Like it's an attack that's leveraged to like undermine the work. And I think it's okay to we should name that too. It doesn't mean that it's not a potent one. It is a potent one, but it is an attack.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why even I mentioned the question, that I think we should question this frame, like this, oh, it's like democratic socialism and gentrification, like associated. Yeah, I mean, it's actually, thank you for that, Sia. Like it's a political attack. So we have to make, the self-criticism and assess, all the time our work, but also have in mind that this, is a way of diminishing and the work and the advancements that the progressive sector has made in the past years. So we actually don't have further questions from the audience.
We do lightning round.
Was that?
We do lightning round. Is that how we finish?
Do
we finish with a lightning round like the debate? It's like,
So I actually want to pass it on to you all again and ask if you want to share if you have any sort of closing remarks or things that you wanted to add before we wrap up.
I guess my last closing, like I think that like we also have to stop as we think about like building our ranks and building organization. We do also have to stop like otherizing the community. And I think the community is such a strange turn of phrase these days. So it's like, there's us, the left, and then there's like the people, the community. And it's like, we're the same thing. So like, let's get over ourselves a little bit. And that's a challenge to, myself as an organizer and all of us as organizers. It's not that complicated to get involved in something like tenant organizing in your building or in your neighborhood. It is less exciting than it sounds. Maybe it's like kind of boring and you're talking about like roof leaks and I don't know, mold. Like it can be kind of dull work, but it is about building those ties, and that's over time. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so I would just encourage people to start talking to their neighbors more. It's very important.
Thank you, Sia.
I'm going to let Susan have the last word. So I'll just say, I just want to like echo that point. I have a friend, when I start complaining about the union, our union at Cuny, and I'll sort of be like, the union this, the union that, and she'll be like, you are the union. Like, what are you doing? Like, so I mean, I think that notion is like super important. I'm not that kind of that othering. I guess just having just said the thing about like the important, like sort of like raising the importance of electoral politics. I guess I've been in this conversation also thinking about, I'm thinking about Susan's point about different kinds, like sort of avoiding a kind of like left, punishment mode, and as someone who's been a student, for example, of like the abolitionist movement, the ways in which certain kinds of movements affect things at the level of like discourse, at the level of political, sort of political imagination, right? Not everything always necessarily shows up in the like election box score, right? So just sort of trying to think, I don't want to say holistically because I'm not a fan of that word, but trying to sort of think about the way electoral politics and like other movements, can actually supplement each other rather than looking like a sort of false choice.
I guess I have a couple things to say, but first of all, people, annoying people sorry, in the media would ask me questions about why isn't the left, involved in the mayor's race? And I would say the left has already shaped the mayor's race, because many of the things that the mayoral candidates talk about are things that the left has put on the agenda. Like, for example, publicly owned utilities. That's something that wouldn't have been a question for mayoral candidates 4 years ago, but that's something that the left, right, that the DSA and coalition of climate activists have put on the agenda, something that that they all have to answer to. And the other thing too is that, like, yes, Eric Adams is conservative, and yes, Andrew Yang is a neoliberal reactionary, and Maya Wiley is just elite professional class person, and Carson Garcia is just fundamentally a person who claims to be a technocrat but is also quite conservative. But yet we see them creating and crafting these complicated policies, again, all of them responding to things that we've been demanding for so long, including things like safe streets, which isn't a left issue, but is, to me, a socialist issue, right? Because it's our immigrant communities, it's our working class communities who are hurt the most by vehicular traffic and as cyclists, and as well as being affected by air quality. I guess finally, what I found interesting is how certain political leaders rush to defend Cuomo from very credible multiple accusations of sexual harassment and workplace misconduct happening in real time. And we didn't see that happening for Scott Stringer, which demonstrates to me that the norms are there, but ultimately power matters quite a lot. And people defending their power seems to matter quite a lot more than actual dedication to, gender justice and this kind of thing. So, clearly they matter a lot less for certain targets than others.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you so much, Tony and Sia, for bringing your views tonight. I hope that I learned a lot, and I hope that our audience has, enjoyed this almost 2 hours that we spent together. I want to say also that it's very important to, as we are experiencing, as using Sia's great frame, like growing pains, that we never take anything for granted, like our advancements, our achievements, but we also keep making assessment of our activism all the time, and having conversations like that, not only, of course, in moments of big moments like this, but on a regular basis. Are we going to the right direction? Are we thinking, are our baby steps leading us, on the path of transformative change, or are we walking these steps, thinking that we are going somewhere when we are actually heading in another direction? So I invite everybody to keep this conversation going. And yeah, hope maybe some of us here can actually reunite again in the future and make this assessment. So thank you so much again, Tony, Sia, and Susan. And thank you everybody who watched it. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Cora. Thank you, Mark, for the support to this event.
Thank you, Nara, for bringing us together.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.